The land around Stonefall Ranch did not care for the men who walked it. It was a vast and terrible beauty, a place of jagged granite peaks that clawed at a sky so pale it looked bled of all color. The wind, a constant and lonely traveler, whispered secrets through the sparse, thirsty pines that clung to the rocky soil. It was a place that promised nothing and would take everything if you let it. This was the world of Jedediah Stone, and the silence of the land had long ago seeped into his bones. His ranch, Stonefall, was aptly named. It felt as though it were in a perpetual state of collapse. The main house, built by his father's hands, listed slightly to one side, its paint peeled away by years of sun and ice to show the weary gray wood beneath. The barn roof sagged in the middle, and the corrals looked like broken teeth against the horizon. A palpable sense of misfortune clung to the air, thick as the dust that rose with every step. It was a decay of the soul as much as of the wood and stone. Jedediah moved through his days with the economy of a man who had no wasted motion left in him. He was tall and lean, carved from the same hard material as the land itself. His face was a mask of hardened grief, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and they rarely settled on another person for more than a moment. He was 30 years old, but looked a decade older. The lines around his eyes and mouth etched not by laughter, but by a sorrow so deep it had become a part of his features. This morning, he was mending a fence line near the west pasture. A post had rotted through at the base, and the wire lay slack and useless on the ground. It was a chore he had done 100 times. The fences on this land seemed to break of their own accord, succumbing to a relentless, unseen pressure. He dug a new post hole with practiced, rhythmic thrusts of the auger, his muscles coiling and releasing under a faded chambray shirt. His only companion was a sturdy buckskin horse named Cain, who watched him with placid intelligence. "Another day, another hole to dig," Jedediah murmured, his voice a low rasp, unused for much else. Cain flicked an ear in response. Jedediah spoke more to his horse in a single week than he had to any person in the last year. The horse did not judge, did not pity, and did not fear him. It was more than he could say for the people of Redemption Creek. The trip to town was a necessity he postponed as long as possible. With his larder nearly empty and the salt running low, he had no choice. He saddled Cain, tied his meager list to the horn, and rode out from under the long shadow of the peaks, leaving the oppressive quiet of Stonefall for the equally oppressive quiet he knew would greet him in town. Redemption Creek sat in a wide spot in the valley, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings huddled together as if for warmth. As Jedediah rode down the main street, the atmosphere shifted. A woman sweeping her porch stopped, her broom frozen mid-swing, and pulled her 2 small children behind her skirt. 2 old men whittling on a bench fell silent, their knives still. Conversations on the boardwalk died in the throat, and folks turned to watch him pass, their expressions a careful blend of pity and fear. They looked at him like a man who carried a sickness. He swung down in front of Thorne's general store and tied Cain to the hitching rail. The bell above the door announced his entry with a cheerful jingle that was immediately swallowed by the sudden hush inside. Elias Thorne, a man whose round belly and balding head spoke of a life lived far from hardship, was measuring out flour for a customer. He stopped, his scoop hovering over the sack. "Jedediah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Jedediah nodded once and walked toward the counter, his spurs ringing softly on the worn floorboards. He could feel every eye on his back. He could hear the whispers, faint but sharp as burrs. The Stonefall place. That fire. Never should have gone back. He placed his list on the counter. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges for his Winchester. The basics for a man living alone. Elias cleared his throat and began gathering the items, his movement stiff and deliberate. "Things holding up out there, Jedediah?" Elias asked, not looking at him. It was always the same question, freighted with meaning. He was not asking about the ranch. He was asking about the curse. "They are what they are," Jedediah said, his voice flat. The story was a local legend now, polished smooth with a decade of retelling. The story of the fire that had consumed his home one winter night, taking his father, his mother, and his little sister, Lily. Jedediah had been the only one to survive, found wandering in the snow, his hands burned and his mind broken with grief. The townsfolk had their theories. Some said his father had made a deal with dark forces for the land's water rights, and the payment had come due. Others whispered that the land itself was soured, a place that bred tragedy. They all agreed on one thing: a shadow hung over Stonefall, and Jedediah Stone was a fool for living under it. He endured the weight of their stares with a stoic silence that they mistook for arrogance, or worse, for guilt. He paid for his supplies, counted his change, and turned to leave. He never lingered. It was then that he saw her. She had just arrived on the afternoon stage, a solitary figure standing in the dusty street, holding a single, worn carpet bag. She was not like the women of Redemption Creek. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, long and dark, pulled back in a simple braid. Her cheekbones were high, her skin a shade darker than was common, hinting at a heritage the town would not understand. Her clothes were for travel, not for show. A sturdy brown skirt, a simple blouse, and worn leather boots. But it was her demeanor that truly set her apart. She stood with a calm stillness, her gaze level and unafraid as she surveyed the town that was already beginning to judge her. She walked into the general store, the bell announcing her arrival to a room still thick with Jedediah's recent presence. The whispers started again, this time with a new target. Jedediah paused by the door, an observer in the shadows. The woman approached the counter, her steps measured and confident. "Good afternoon," she said to Elias Thorne. Her voice was low and clear. "I was told I might find directions here." Elias eyed her with open suspicion, his gaze flicking over her face, her clothes. "Directions to where?" "The old mission, the one at the base of the canyon, a few miles out of town." A new wave of silence fell over the store. The old mission had been abandoned for 20 years, a crumbling adobe ruin where no one went. It was said to be haunted by the ghosts of priests and the natives they had tried to convert. "Ain't nothing out there," Elias said flatly. "Place is falling down, not fit for man nor beast." "Nevertheless," the woman said, her calm unwavering, "that is where I am headed." The tension in the store was a physical thing. It was the friction of the unknown rubbing against a small, fearful world. Elias gave her the directions grudgingly. His words clipped. Jedediah watched the woman. Ilara, he would later learn, was her name. He saw the subtle tightening of her jaw as she endured the hostile stares, the slight lift of her chin. She was an outcast, same as him. A flicker of something he had not felt in years, a dull and rusty stirring of kinship, moved within his chest. She took her leave, walking back out into the unforgiving sunlight without a backward glance. Jedediah watched her go before mounting Cain and riding home. The woman's quiet strength a strange and unsettling image in his mind. Weeks passed. The sun grew weaker, its light turning thin and watery. The nights grew teeth. Winter did not creep in that year. It fell upon the land like a hawk on its prey. Swift and vicious. The creek that gave the town its name turned sluggish, then iced over at the edges. The ground hardened to iron, and the wind that swept down from the peaks no longer whispered. It howled, carrying the bite of death. For Jedediah and Stonefall, the early winter was another turn of the screw. His small herd of cattle began to sicken. It started with a cough, a deep, rattling sound that echoed in the cold air. Then they would grow weak, their breath coming in ragged plumes of steam, until one morning he would find one lying still in the frost-covered pasture. It was a lung sickness. The veterinarian in town had said on his one and only visit, shaking his head. There was no cure he knew of. Jedediah lost 2 head, then 3 more. Each loss was a blow to his precarious finances, another confirmation in the eyes of his neighbors that the Stonefall curse was real and working its slow, grinding destruction. A familiar, crushing despair settled over him, heavy as a shroud. He felt like a man trapped in a deep well, the circle of light above him growing smaller and smaller with each passing day. Then the blizzard came. It began as a dusting of snow, but by midday, the sky had turned a bruised, churning gray. The world dissolved into a vortex of white. The wind screamed, tearing at the barn and the house, finding every crack and crevice. Visibility dropped to nothing. Jedediah had been out checking on what was left of his herd, trying to push them into the relative shelter of a small canyon. When the full force of the storm hit, he turned Cain for home, but home had vanished. All landmarks were gone, erased by the blinding, horizontal snow. He was lost on his own land. The cold was a physical thing, stealing the breath from his lungs and leaching the warmth from his body. Disoriented and freezing, he let Cain have his head, trusting the horse's instincts over his own. They stumbled on for what felt like hours, a slow, desperate march through a featureless hell. Just when a numb and deadly weariness began to take hold of him, Cain stopped. Through the swirling snow, Jedediah saw a dark shape looming ahead. It was the crumbling wall of the old mission, and in one of its empty window frames, a faint, flickering light. He nearly wept with relief. He slid from the saddle, his limbs stiff and clumsy with cold, and half led, half dragged Cain towards the light. An old, heavy wooden door was set into the adobe wall. He pushed it open and stumbled inside, the wind howling at his back. The interior was a single large room, but she had transformed a corner of it into a small pocket of warmth and order amidst the chaos of the derelict building. A fire burned in the ancient stone hearth, casting a warm, golden glow. The floor was swept clean of debris. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a few meager belongings were arranged with a neatness that defied the surrounding ruin. Ilara was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in a blanket. She looked up as he entered, and her face held no surprise, only a calm recognition. "You look half frozen," she said, her voice the same low, steady tone he remembered from the store. She rose and came toward him. "Get close to the fire. I will see to your horse." Jedediah was too cold and exhausted to argue. He shed his snow-caked coat and hat and collapsed onto a stool near the hearth, extending his numb, trembling hands to the flames. The warmth was a painful, blessed thing. He watched as she led Cain into a sheltered alcove, rubbing the horse down with a dry sack and giving him a small measure of oats from her own limited supplies. They were trapped together for 3 days as the blizzard raged outside, sealing the world away. The initial hours were filled with a sparse, practical silence. Jedediah was wary, conditioned by a decade of isolation. He was not used to sharing a space, not used to the presence of another human being. Ilara was self-possessed and observant, her quietness a source of strength, not shyness. She moved with a purpose that he found himself watching, her hands always busy, stoking the fire, grinding herbs with a stone pestle, checking the seal she had made around the windows with mud and straw. On the second day, the silence began to thaw. He was cleaning his knife when it slipped, opening a deep gash across the palm of his hand. He swore under his breath, wrapping it in his neckerchief, but blood quickly soaked through. Ilara came to him without a word. She took his hand gently in hers, unwrapped the cloth, and examined the cut with a professional eye. She cleaned it with water she had melted from snow and then applied a green, fragrant poultice of herbs. Her touch was gentle, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Yarrow," she said, her first unsolicited words to him. "It will stop the bleeding and keep it clean." He grunted in acknowledgement, but he felt a strange warmth spread from her touch, something that had nothing to do with the fire. Later that day, a loose shutter on the far side of the room began to bang violently in the wind, the sound like a hammer against his raw nerves. He took his tools and, with her holding a lantern, went out into the howling gale of the sheltered entryway and secured it, his half-frozen fingers clumsy on the nails. They did not speak, but the shared act was a form of communication, a small offering of competence against the chaos. On the third day, the wind finally began to die down, during a brief lull in the storm, when the world outside was a strange, bruised twilight. Jedediah grew restless. "I have to check my barn," he said, his voice raw. "See what is left." Ilara looked at him, her dark eyes seeing the desperation etched on his face. "The storm is not over." "I do not care," he said, pulling on his still damp coat. She watched him for a moment, then reached for her own heavy shawl. "Then I will come with you." The journey to his ranch was a nightmare. The snow was waist-deep in places. The landscape transformed into an alien world of white drifts and skeletal trees. When they finally reached his barn, his heart sank. A section of the roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. They pushed their way inside. The air was frigid. In the dim light, they saw the devastation. 2 more of his cattle lay dead, frozen in the snow that had blown in through the broken roof, and in the farthest stall, huddled against the still body of its mother, was a newborn calf. It was impossibly small, its dark coat covered in ice, shivering so violently it seemed it might shake apart. It let out a weak, bleeding cry, a sound of pure misery. Jedediah stared at it, and something inside him finally broke. 10 years of grief, of failure, of fighting a battle he could not win, crashed down upon him. This tiny, dying creature was the final straw, the ultimate proof that Stonefall was a place where life could not survive. His face crumpled, the stoic mask shattering to reveal the raw defeat beneath. He turned away, unable to look. But Ilara did not turn away. She knelt in the snow beside the calf, her face set with a fierce determination. She placed a hand on its trembling flank. "She is still fighting," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. She looked up at Jedediah. "Bring it inside, to the house, now!" Her command cut through his despair. He looked from her determined face to the dying calf and back again. For the first time in a decade, someone was refusing to accept the fate this land dealt out. He moved without thinking, scooping the frigid, lightweight animal into his arms. They carried it to the ranch house, a place that had not known a visitor in 10 years. He kicked the door open and laid the calf on the dusty hearth, while he fought to build a fire with shaking hands. Ilara worked. She stripped off her wet shawl and began rubbing the calf vigorously, trying to bring life back into its frozen limbs. The scene was intimate and desperate. The fire caught, its flickering light pushing back the shadows in the long, silent room. They worked together, their hands brushing, their breathing mingling in the cold air. Ilara sent him for warm water and cloths, directing him with quiet authority. She crushed herbs and mixed them with the water, forcing a few drops past the calf's lips. She never stopped talking to it, a low, encouraging murmur in a language he did not understand, a song of life in a house of ghosts. Hours passed. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. And then, a miracle. The calf's shivering began to subside. It lifted its head, its dark eyes blinking in the firelight. It took a shaky, deep breath. A little while later, with Jedediah's help, it staggered to its feet, wobbly and weak, but alive. Jedediah stared at the creature, then at Ilara. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair falling from its braid. But in the soft light of the fire, she looked powerful. They had defied the storm, defied the curse, defied death itself. This shared act, this stubborn refusal to surrender, forged a connection between them that was stronger than any spoken word. For the first time since the night of the fire, A glimmer of something that felt terrifyingly like hope flickered to life in the desolate landscape of Jedediah Stone's heart. The blizzard broke as violently as it had arrived, leaving behind a world remade in silence and blinding white. The sun rose on a landscape of pristine, deadly beauty. Every rock and pine branch sheathed in a layer of glistening ice. The air was so cold and clear it felt sharp in the lungs. In the wake of the storm, the world seemed to hold its breath, a fragile and perfect stillness that Jedediah knew was a lie. Underneath the beauty was the threat of a deep and final cold. He found Alara preparing to leave, bundling her few possessions back into her carpet bag. The small calf, whom she had taken to calling Flicker for the way its life had nearly been snuffed out, was sleeping soundly on a bed of sacks by the hearth. "Where do you think you are going?" Jedediah asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Back to the mission," she said, not looking at him. "The storm has passed." He thought of the mission's crumbling walls and the section of barn roof that had already collapsed under the snow's weight. He thought of her, alone, in that ruin. "You cannot," he said. "The roof will not hold another snow. It is not safe." She finally turned to face him, her dark eyes searching his. "Mr. Stone, I am grateful for your help, but people in this valley—" She trailed off, letting the unspoken truth hang in the air between them. "People will talk." "Let them," Jedediah said, the words coming out with a force that surprised him. For 10 years, he had lived his life according to the shape of their whispers, bending and breaking himself around their judgment. For the first time, a different feeling, a stubborn refusal, took root in him. "You saved my calf. You saved me from freezing to death on my own land. It is not right for you to go back to that place. Stay the winter. The work will be payment for your board, if that sets your mind at ease." She hesitated, the logic of his offer warring with her instinct for self-preservation. To be an outcast alone was one thing. To be the outcast living with the cursed man of Stonefall was another entirely. But the memory of the howling wind and the deep, penetrating cold was still fresh. The logic was undeniable. She gave a single, slow nod. For the winter, her moving in was a quiet affair. She brought her carpet bag and several cloth-wrapped bundles of herbs and roots from the mission, her entire worldly possessions fitting easily in a corner of the spare room upstairs. That room had been his sister Lily's, and it had been untouched for a decade, a shrine of dust and memory. Jedediah had not been able to bring himself to clear it out, and now he felt a pang of guilt for putting Alara there, among the ghosts. But Alara's presence was not an intrusion. It was a quiet disruption, a subtle shift in the gravitational pull of the house. The ranch was a place frozen in time, held captive by Jedediah's grief. The air was thick with things unsaid, with memories that had soured into regrets. A small, dust-covered rocking horse stood silent in a corner of the main room, a piece of his mother's needlepoint, depicting a field of bluebonnets, hung crookedly on the wall. These were relics of a life that had ended abruptly in fire and smoke. Alara did not disturb these things. Instead, she brought her own life into the empty spaces between them. She brewed a pungent herbal tea in the mornings that scented the entire house, chasing away the stale smell of dust and sorrow. She tended the fire with a patient hand, so it burned brighter and warmer than Jedediah's sullen, smoldering blazes. Sometimes, as she worked, she would hum, a low, melodic sound that seemed to smooth the jagged edges of the silence. Her presence was a slow, steady breath being drawn back into the lungs of the house. Her knowledge proved to be a quiet revelation, a week after the storm, when the snow had melted back in the sun-drenched spots. She walked the winter pasture with him. The few remaining cattle were still weak, their coughing fits a constant, grim reminder of his failing fortunes. Alara moved slowly, her eyes scanning the ground, not the animals. She knelt and plucked a plant with delicate, star-like white flowers growing in a patch near the water trough. "What is this?" she asked, holding it out to him. "Just a weed," he grunted. Its common name is death camas, she said, her voice even. The bulbs are poison. One is enough to sicken a cow. Several will kill it. They mistake it for wild onion when forage is scarce. Jedediah looked from the plant to the ailing cattle, and a cold knot of understanding formed in his gut. His father had taught him about the dangers of loco weed and larkspur. But this plant was unfamiliar. He had been so focused on the idea of a supernatural curse that he had failed to see the danger growing right under his feet. His initial skepticism gave way to a grudging respect. They spent the next 2 days working side by side, their gloved hands pulling the toxic weeds from the cold, damp earth, piling them high to be burned. She made tinctures for the sickest animals, grinding roots and herbs with a stone mortar and pestle. Her movements sure and practiced. She brewed a dark, steaming mash that smelled of pine and earth and mixed it with their feed. Jedediah watched her, his silence no longer born of wariness, but of a profound and growing awe. He had always seen the land as his adversary, a cursed inheritance that gave only hardship. Through her eyes, he began to see it differently. It was a place that held remedies as well as afflictions, a place of balance he had never learned to read. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. Jedediah recognized the horse first, a magnificent black stallion that could only belong to one man, Silas Croft. Croft was the wealthiest man in the county, his holdings vast and his influence absolute. He dismounted with a fluid grace, a handsome man in a tailored coat and fine leather boots, his smile wide and charismatic, but his eyes, a pale and piercing blue, were as cold as creek ice. "Jedediah, my boy," Croft boomed, clapping Jed on the shoulder. "Just making some neighborly rounds after that devil of a storm. Wanted to be sure you were still among the living." "I am here," Jedediah said, his body tense. It was then that Croft's eyes landed on Elara, who had emerged from the barn. His smile tightened, and his gaze lingered on her, a slow, predatory appraisal that made Jedediah's hand itch to move toward the axe leaning against the woodpile. "Well now, what have we here?" Croft said, his tone turning slick. "It seems the stories are true. You have taken in a stray." Elara met his gaze without flinching, her expression unreadable. Croft turned his attention back to Jedediah, his voice dropping to a confidential, concerned tone. "Son, this place has brought you nothing but misery. That unfortunate business with your family, this sickness in your herd, it is a heavy legacy to bear." He gestured expansively at the ranch. "Let me take it off your hands. I will give you a fair price, more than fair, enough to start fresh. Somewhere the shadows are not so long." The offer was framed as a kindness, a mercy, but Jedediah heard the ambition coiling beneath it. Croft did not want to help him. He wanted his land, and more importantly, the water rights that came with it. "The ranch is not for sale, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice flat and final. For a fleeting second, Croft's friendly facade dropped. The smile vanished, and the coldness in his eyes sharpened into something hard and dangerous. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Stubborn, just like your father," he said. He mounted his horse, then looked from Jedediah to Elara and back again. "A word of advice. Jedediah, a man is judged by the company he keeps. Folks in Redemption Creek are simple. They fear what they do not understand." He gave Elara one last, lingering look before turning his stallion and riding away, leaving a trail of discord in the air behind him. Croft's warning proved prophetic. The next time they rode into town for supplies, the change was immediate and venomous. The whispers were no longer just about the Stonefall curse. They were about the woman who now lived there. They said she was a witch, a heathen who had used her dark arts to ensnare the cursed rancher. Her strange remedies were black magic, her knowledge a gift from the devil. The hostility was no longer veiled in pity. It was open and raw. Martha Gable, a woman whose child Elara had once offered a sweet root to, pulled the boy away as if from a venomous snake. At the general store, Elias Thorne served them with undisguised contempt, placing their goods on the counter and pointedly avoiding Alara's hands when she reached for them. The prejudice was a suffocating, tangible thing, a wall that rose up around them, pushing them further and further into their shared isolation. They rode home in silence, the town's hatred a bitter taste in their mouths. A week later, a tragedy far darker than whispers struck. Jedediah rose before dawn to a strange and unnatural stillness. There was no lowing from the pasture, no sound of movement. A cold dread washed over him as he pulled on his boots and walked out into the gray morning light. The sight that met him stopped his heart. A small group of his 5 remaining healthy cattle, the ones who had recovered, the ones who represented his last shred of hope, lay dead. They were scattered around the water trough, their bodies bloated, their legs stiff in the frosted grass. There were no signs of sickness, no struggle, only a quiet, sudden death. Jedediah walked to the trough, his movements stiff, robotic. He saw the faint sheen of oil on the water's surface. Poison. His eyes scanned the damp ground nearby, and there, partially scuffed but still visible, were the tracks of a single rider. Someone had come in the night. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath his feet, that this was Croft's doing. There was no proof, nothing but the tracks of a horse that could belong to anyone. But he knew. This was not a curse. This was not misfortune. This was malice. The financial loss was devastating. It pushed him from the edge of ruin squarely into the abyss. But it was the cruelty of it, the deliberate, hateful act that shattered him. He retreated into himself, into the cold, familiar fortress of his despair. All the progress he had made, the small flicker of hope Alara had kindled, was extinguished. The darkness rushed back in, more complete and suffocating than ever before. He was silent for 2 days, a walking ghost on his own land. Alara gave him space, her presence a quiet, constant question he refused to answer. On the 3rd night, the dam of his grief finally broke. He found her by the fire, mending one of his shirts, the needle moving in a steady, rhythmic pattern. "Maybe they are right," he said, his voice a raw tear in the quiet room. "Maybe you are the curse." Alara's hands stilled. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a sad and patient light. "Why do you stay here?" he lashed out, the words born of pain and a desperate, misguided need to protect her by driving her away. "Look at what has happened. Everything I had left is gone. All you have brought me is more trouble." She did not flinch. She did not back down. She placed the shirt in her lap and rose to face him, her small frame radiating a strength that belied her size. "The trouble was here long before I was Jedediah," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "The poisoned cattle, the whispers in town. That is the work of a greedy man. Not a curse. Your real trouble is the fire that happened 10 years ago." "Do not speak of that," he choked out. "I must," she insisted, her gaze holding his. "Because you have let the ghost of that night rule you ever since. You have let it convince you that you are cursed, that you are doomed to fail. The curse is not in the land, Jedediah. It is in you. It is the fear you carry, the guilt you will not put down. It is easier to blame a shadow than to fight a man like Silas Croft. Is it not?" Her words were the plain, unvarnished truth, a truth so painful and so long avoided that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had hidden behind the town's superstitions because it was easier than facing the simple, ugly reality of human evil. He had nursed his grief like a precious wound because he did not know who he was without it. He had no answer for her. The raw, emotional honesty of her words shattered the walls he had spent a decade building. He turned and left the house, walking out into the cold, clear night, the stars a million unblinking, indifferent eyes. Later that night, the anger spent, replaced by a deep and hollow shame. He returned, He found her where he had left her, sitting by the fire, her hands idle in her lap. The room was warm and quiet. He stood in the doorway for a long time before he found his voice. "I am sorry," he said, the words thick and clumsy in his throat. "What I said, I was wrong." She looked up at him, and there was no judgment in her eyes, only a profound and weary understanding. She nodded once, accepting his apology without the need for more words. He walked over and sank onto the stool opposite her, the firelight flickering between them. The moment of vulnerability had opened a door inside him, a door that had been nailed shut for years. He found himself speaking, the words coming slowly at first, then with a steadier current, like a frozen river beginning to thaw. He told her about his sister, Lily. He did not speak of the fire, not of the end. He spoke of a summer afternoon, years before, when Lily was 6. He remembered her laughter, high and bright as a bird's song, as she tried to catch grasshoppers in the tall meadow grass. He told Alara how Lily had made a crown of wildflowers for him and called him the King of Stonefall. It was a small, simple memory, one he had not allowed himself to touch in years, for fear it would burn him. Alara listened. She did not speak, did not offer platitudes or pity. She simply listened, her presence a comforting balm, a quiet space where his story could finally be told. In the warm firelight, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the threat of an uncertain future, they found a small pocket of solace. The pain was still there, a great and terrible thing, but for the first time, it did not feel like his alone. When he finished speaking, a deep and companionable silence settled between them. He looked at her strong, quiet face illuminated by the flames, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her fingers were warm and closed around his. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, more elemental. It was a profound, shared understanding of pain and survival. It was a silent promise to face the darkness together. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent thaw. The snow retreated grudgingly, melting in torrents that turned the gullies into roaring streams. The land that emerged was scarred and bruised from the winter's assault, the ground a patchwork of mud and stubborn ice. But it was resilient. In the sheltered places, the first green shoots of grass pushed their way toward the sun with a fierce and desperate courage. It was a landscape that mirrored the two souls living at its heart. Jedediah and Alara worked from the thin light of dawn until the last purple shadows fell from the peaks. Their shared labor became a language all its own, a conversation held in the rhythm of a swinging hammer and the heft of a shared log. They rebuilt the collapsed section of the barn roof, their movements falling into a seamless synchronicity born of mutual reliance. He had the raw strength for the heavy beams. She had the patient, clever hands for the finer work. Their physical closeness, a constant necessity of the work, began to transform their emotional bond into something new, something charged and unspoken, a current of desire, as powerful and undeniable as the spring melt, began to flow between them. It lived in the small, incidental moments that punctuated their days. It was in the way their hands brushed when he passed her a tool, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through them both. It was in the way he would pause in his work to watch her as she tended the small herb garden she had started near the house, her dark hair coming loose from its braid as she knelt in the rich, dark earth. The quiet evenings, once filled with a comfortable, healing silence, were now thick with unspoken feelings. They would sit by the fire, mending tack or sharpening tools, the space between them humming with a tension that had nothing to do with hardship or fear. It was a magnetic pull, a growing awareness of each other that was both thrilling and terrifying. Jedediah, a man who had been a stranger to tenderness for a decade, found himself captivated by the curve of her neck in the firelight, by the low, musical sound of her voice when she spoke to Flicker the calf, who now followed her everywhere like a devoted shadow. But the fragile renewal of spring could not hold back the machinations of men. A letter arrived from the bank in Redemption Creek, delivered by a boy who refused to come closer than the main gate. The crisp, formal language was a death sentence. Due to the significant loss of his herd, the bank was shortening the term of his loan. Full repayment was now due in 60 days. Jedediah did not need to be told that Silas Croft sat on that bank's board of directors. This was Croft's hand, squeezing the life from Stonefall. The news sent Jedediah spiraling back into a dark and familiar despair. He was trapped. The loss of the cattle meant he had no income, no way to satisfy the note. The only option was the one he could not bear to consider: selling the ranch. The idea felt like a profound betrayal, the final surrender of his family's memory to the very forces that had haunted them. He saw his father's proud face, his mother's gentle smile, his sister's bright laughter, all turning to dust under Croft's victorious boot. Alara found him standing by the family plot on the hill behind the house, the 3 simple wooden markers a testament to all he had lost. She saw the anguish in the set of his shoulders, the utter defeat in his eyes. "There is another way," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. He shook his head, not looking at her. "There is nothing left." "There are the mustangs," she said. "The wild horses in the high canyons. I have seen them, a herd of at least 20. They run on your land. Jedediah, by law, they are yours to take." He turned to her then, his expression a mixture of disbelief and weary skepticism. "They are wild, Alara, not ranch horses. Rounding them up is brutal work, dangerous. Breaking them takes months, and a skill I am not sure I still have." "But a herd of broken mustangs would be worth a great deal of money," she pressed, her gaze firm. "Enough to pay the bank, enough to save this place." Her belief in him was a tangible thing, a spark of light against his darkness. "We can do it," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Together." It was a desperate, reckless plan, a gamble against long odds. But it was a plan of action, a plan of defiance. It was better than the slow, suffocating surrender that awaited him. He looked at her, at the strength and resolve in her face, and, for the first time, he felt the stirrings of a fight he thought he had long since lost. The Mustang Drive was a descent into a primal world. The high country was a treacherous maze of sharp ravines, sun-baked mesas, and slopes of unstable rock that could give way without warning. For 2 weeks, they lived in the saddle, their world shrinking to the taste of dust, the sting of sweat, and the constant, thundering presence of the horses. The work was grueling, pushing them to the absolute limits of their physical and emotional endurance. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a team, a single unit moving against the wildness of the land and the creatures they pursued. His knowledge of the terrain and his raw strength were matched by her patience and her almost mystical ability to read the herd's movements, to anticipate the lead stallion's next charge. They relied on each other for everything, for their very survival. One afternoon, the pale sky turned a bruised purple with frightening speed. A sudden, violent thunderstorm unleashed a torrent of rain, and the dry wash they were crossing became a raging, muddy river in a matter of minutes. Alara's horse, a steady mare named Gracie, lost her footing in the churning water and went down. Alara was thrown, swept away by the powerful current. Without a second's thought, Jedediah spurred Cain into the flood, his rope already in his hand. He fought the current, his eyes locked on her dark head as she struggled to stay afloat. He cast the rope, his aim true, and she caught it, her fingers locking onto it with desperate strength. He pulled her in, his muscles straining, and hauled her from the water, collapsing with her onto the safe bank, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She lay coughing and shivering in his arms, and he held her tight, the feel of her solid, living warmth against him a confirmation that pushed back the terror of nearly losing her. In that moment, soaked and shivering under the dark, angry sky, A bond of absolute trust was forged between them, deeper and stronger than any spoken promise. The emotional climax came a week later, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to scrape against the mountaintops. They were camped in a small, sheltered meadow. The captured mustangs, a dozen in all, milling restlessly in a makeshift corral of rope and rock. The day had been brutal. The lead stallion, a magnificent beast of muscle and fury, had challenged Jedediah, rearing and striking, nearly trampling him before he could turn the horse back. They sat by the fire, exhausted and sore. Alara was tending to the deep, purple bruises blooming across his ribs where a hoof had glanced off him. Her touch was clinical at first, her fingers probing gently for broken bones. But then it softened, lingering on his skin, a silent acknowledgement of the day's danger and his survival. The raw, primal energy of the horse drive, the constant dance with danger and death, had stripped away all their inhibitions, leaving their emotions exposed and raw. "Thank you," Jedediah said, his voice low and raspy. "For what?" she asked, her hand still resting on his side. "For this," he said, his gaze sweeping over the camp, the horses, the vast, silent wilderness around them. He looked back at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she had never seen in him before. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be alive, the blood in my veins, the air in my lungs. I was just a ghost. Before you came." The confession, so simple and profound, hung in the air between them. The simmering desire that had been building for months finally ignited. The vastness of the wilderness, the flickering firelight, the shared exhaustion and triumph, it all converged into a single, overwhelming need. He reached up and tangled his hand in her damp hair, pulling her gently toward him. She met him halfway, her lips finding his in the darkness. Their coming together was a passionate, desperate affirmation of life. It was the heat of skin against the cold night air, the taste of salt and sweat, the wordless language of two souls who had found each other in a desolate world. It was not just an act of passion, but an act of defiance, a claim of life and warmth against the coldness that had threatened to consume them both. They returned to the valley 2 days later, battered, bruised, and bone-weary, but triumphant. They drove a small but valuable herd of 12 captured mustangs into the main corral at Stonefall. They had done it. They had found a way. A feeling of hard-won joy, something Jedediah had not experienced in his adult life, filled his chest. The joy was short-lived. As they approached the barn, they saw it, painted in crude. Dripping red letters across the wide barn door was a single word: heathen. The sight shattered their triumph instantly. It was a brand, a defilement of their home, a message of pure hatred. Silas Croft's campaign of intimidation had escalated, turning the town's superstitious fear into a direct threat. A cold, quiet rage began to build in Jedediah's gut, a rage colder and harder than any he had ever known. Alara stood beside him, her face a pale, still mask. But he saw the deep hurt in her eyes. The word was not for him. It was for her. They learned later that a new rumor was making the rounds in Redemption Creek, a story spun by Croft that Alara had not captured the horses with skill, but had used her dark arts to call them from the hills, bewitching them just as she had bewitched the cursed rancher of Stonefall. But Croft was not finished. He saved his cruelest blow for last. The next day, while Jedediah and Alara were in a far pasture, beginning the arduous work of breaking the first of the mustangs, one of Croft's men snuck onto the property. He did not go to the barn or the house. He went to the small, precious garden Alara had cultivated beside the porch. It was her sanctuary, a small square of earth where she had brought order and life, a place of peace and healing. She had carried the seeds and roots with her, nurtured them, and coaxed them to life in the unforgiving soil. It was a living extension of her identity. When they returned at dusk, they found it utterly destroyed. It was not merely trampled. It was an act of methodical malice. Every plant had been ripped out by the roots and thrown aside to wither. The carefully tended soil had been poisoned, covered in a thick layer of salt that gleamed white and sterile in the fading light, a guarantee that nothing would ever grow there again. For Ilara, this was the ultimate violation. Her composure, the quiet, steady strength that had been her shield against the world's cruelty, finally broke. A dry, ragged sob escaped her throat, and she sank to her knees before the ruined earth, her body shaking with a silent, profound grief. Jedediah stood frozen for a moment, the senseless, vicious cruelty of the act stealing the air from his lungs. Then, a protective rage, purer and more powerful than any emotion he had ever felt, surged through him. He went to her, knelt in the poisoned soil, and pulled her into his arms. He held her as she wept, her tears soaking the front of his shirt. He looked at the destruction, at the woman he loved breaking in his arms, and a terrible clarity settled over him. This was not about land. This was not about a loan. This was about destroying a source of goodness and life simply because it could be destroyed. He finally understood. The curse of Stonefall was not a ghost or a shadow from the past. It was the human heart, twisted by greed and hatred. It had a face, and its name was Silas Croft. And in that moment, holding Ilara, Jedediah Stone knew that he could no longer simply endure. He had to fight back. The rage that had solidified in Jedediah's heart after the destruction of Ilara's garden did not burn hot. It ran cold and deep, a vein of iron reinforcing his will. There was no more room for despair. There was only the work, and the woman he now knew he would protect with his life. The breaking of the Mustangs began in earnest. The work was an arduous, daily negotiation between wildness and trust. Each horse was a different battle, a different soul to understand. The lead stallion, whom Jedediah named Obsidian for his dark, fiery spirit, fought him with every fiber of his being. The process was a metaphor for Jedediah's own taming. His old instincts, forged in solitude and grief, told him to use force, to break the horse's will, but Ilara showed him another way. She moved with a quiet patience that bordered on reverence, her voice a low murmur, her hands gentle. "You do not break their spirit," she told him one evening as they watched the horses in the corral. "You ask them to share it with you. You show them there is no danger here, only partnership." He watched her, and he learned. He tempered his strength with her patience, his dominance with her trust. Together, they found the delicate balance, and one by one, the wild hearts of the Mustangs began to yield. Each horse that finally accepted a saddle, that stood steady under a rider, was a small, defiant victory against the forces trying to crush them. They sold the first 3 tamed horses to a rancher from the next county, a man who cared more for good horse flesh than for the gossip of Redemption Creek. The money, a small but significant stack of bills, provided a temporary reprieve. Jedediah rode to the bank and paid a portion of his debt, buying them a few more precious weeks. The bank manager's surprise was mingled with a displeasure that told Jedediah the news would get back to Silas Croft immediately. Their love, forged in the crucible of the Mustang drive, deepened through the shared struggle of their daily work. Their partnership was seamless now, a silent understanding that flowed between them. They found their joy not in grand triumphs, but in the small, quiet moments that stitched their lives together. A shared meal of rabbit stew at the end of a long day, their weary bodies close by the warmth of the fire. A quiet sunset watched from the porch, the sky bleeding orange and purple over the peaks they now knew so intimately. And at night, the profound and simple feeling of safety in each other's arms, a sanctuary against the growing darkness of the world outside their door. Silas Croft, frustrated by Jedediah's unexpected resilience, shifted his tactics. Financial pressure alone was not breaking the man, so Croft began to poison the well of public opinion, laying the groundwork for a more sinister plan. He started in the saloon, his voice filled with false concern as he spoke to the men at the bar. "It is a strange thing," he would say, swirling the amber whiskey in his glass. "The blight on my cornfields, it stops right at the border of the Stonefall property, as if a line was drawn." He would sigh, shaking his head. "And my prize-winning heifer gave birth to a stillborn calf this morning. The vet can find no natural cause. Things have not been right in this valley since that woman arrived." They were lies, carefully crafted and seeded into the fertile ground of the town's superstition. He did not need to make direct accusations. The fearful, insular community of Redemption Creek was more than capable of connecting the dots themselves. His opportunity to fan the embers of fear into a wildfire arrived on the back of a sway-backed mule. Reverend Gideon Blackwood was a traveling preacher, a man whose gaunt frame was consumed by the fire of his own fanaticism. His eyes burned with a righteous certainty, and his voice was a tool of immense power, capable of stroking fear and hatred into a righteous frenzy. He set up a tent at the edge of town and began his sermons. Croft saw the preacher for the perfect instrument he was. He attended the first sermon, sitting in the front row, his expression pious and concerned. Afterwards, he approached the preacher, introducing himself as a pillar of the community, a man deeply worried for the souls of his neighbors. He fed Reverend Blackwood his carefully constructed stories of blighted crops and unnatural deaths, framing Ilara not just as an outsider, but as an unholy influence, a danger to the very fabric of their Christian lives. The preacher's sermons became increasingly inflammatory. He was no longer just preaching against sin. He was preaching against a specific sinner. He thundered from his makeshift pulpit about the heathen woman who had taken root in their valley, a serpent in their midst. He spoke of the cursed man who harbored her, a man who had turned his back on God and embraced the shadows. "The Lord will not suffer a witch to live among his flock," Blackwood roared, his voice cracking with fervor, his shadow dancing on the canvas wall of the tent. "The blight on your fields is a sign. The death of your livestock is a warning. Cleanse yourselves, people of Redemption Creek, before the wrath of God falls upon you all." The town's fear, stoked by Croft's whispers and now sanctified by the preacher's holy rage, was honed to a sharp and dangerous edge. Jedediah and Ilara were now completely ostracized. When they rode to town, they were met with undisguised hatred. Elias Thorne refused them service at the store, barring the door and telling them their money was not welcome there. Parents snatched their children from the street and hurried inside, some making a sign with their fingers to ward off evil. They were treated as if they were the plague. It was during one of these rare, necessary trips for grain that a new and darker threat emerged. Ilara had gone to the livery to check on a loose shoe on her mare, while Jedediah dealt with the feed merchant. A man stepped out of the shadows of the stable, a silver star pinned to his vest. He was big and broad-shouldered, with a cruel, self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Well, I will be," the man said, his voice a low drawl. Abigail Hobbs, I never thought I would see you again." Ilara froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. It was a name she had not heard in 5 years, a name she had buried along with the life it belonged to. "You have the wrong person," she said, her voice tight. The U.S. Marshal, whose name was Harding, chuckled. "Oh, I do not think so. I remember that face. I was the one who came to investigate after your husband, Thomas, turned up dead. A powerful family. The Hobbses, they were mighty convinced his pretty young wife had something to do with his accident. The past she had run from for so long had finally caught up to her. The truth was a dark and tragic story. She had been Abigail, married at 16 to Thomas Hobbs, a man whose charm was a thin veneer over a violent and jealous nature. The abuse had been relentless, escalating until the night he had nearly killed her in a drunken rage. She had fled, taking nothing with her, and had never looked back. Weeks later, she had heard the news that he had died in a drunken brawl, stabbed by a card sharp, but his wealthy family, ashamed of the truth, had created their own narrative. They blamed her, the seductive, half-native girl who had bewitched their son and then orchestrated his murder. They had put a price on her head, forcing her to live as a fugitive, to become Elara, a woman without a past.
"He died in a fight,"
Elara said, her voice a strained whisper. "That is one version of the story," Marshal Harding said, his eyes glinting with cruel opportunism. "His family has another. They have a lot of influence in that territory. A man like me, he could make a lot of trouble for you. Or he could be persuaded to forget he ever saw you." He let the implication hang in the air. He was not just a lawman. He was a predator who had scented an opportunity. That night, back in the fragile safety of Stonefall, Elara was consumed by a terrifying certainty. She was a danger to Jedediah. Her past, this dark secret she had carried for so long, was a weapon that Croft and his allies would not hesitate to use against them. She found Jedediah in the barn, rubbing down his horse after the long ride. She told him everything, her voice low and steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told him her real name, about her marriage, about the abuse, and about the powerful family that wanted her branded a murderer. When she was finished, she looked at him, her heart aching with a terrible, preemptive grief. "I have to leave. Jedediah," she said, the words costing her everything. "If they find out, if this marshal tells them, they will have a reason to come for you. They will say you are harboring a fugitive, a murderer. It will give Croft everything he needs to destroy you. I cannot let that happen." She offered to disappear again, to sacrifice the only home, the only love she had ever known, to protect him. This was the crucial test. Jedediah listened to her story, his expression unreadable, his face cast in shadow. He was so still, so silent, that her hope began to wither. She had brought him nothing but trouble, and now, this, the final, damning proof that she was a curse upon him. But instead of pushing her away, instead of the anger or condemnation she expected, he moved toward her. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and solid, an anchor in the storm of her fear. He held her for a long moment before he spoke, his voice a low, rough vow against her hair. "Your name is Elara," he said. "Your past does not matter. The man you were married to is dead, and whatever he did to you died with him." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own gaze burning with an unwavering conviction. "This is your home now. Stonefall is your home, and I will not let Harding or Croft or anyone else drive you away from it. Do you understand me?" His unwavering acceptance, his unconditional love, was a profound and shattering moment of healing for Elara. All her life, she had been an outsider, a fugitive, a woman defined by the prejudices of others and the sins of a violent man. In Jedediah's arms, for the first time, she felt truly safe. She felt unconditionally loved. She clung to him, tears of relief and gratitude finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheeks. The tension, however, escalated dramatically in the days that followed. Marshal Harding, his pockets likely lined with Silas Croft's money, began a quiet and official-looking investigation. He spoke to the townsfolk in the saloon and the general store, his questions leading them to all the conclusions Croft wanted. He validated their worst suspicions, giving the weight of the law to their superstitious hatred. The preacher's rhetoric reached its fever pitch. His final sermon was not a warning. It was a call to arms. He stood before the crowd, his face contorted in a mask of righteous fury, and pointed a trembling finger in the direction of Stonefall Ranch.
"The time for prayer is over," he screamed. "The time for action is now. The righteous must not suffer the wicked to fester in their midst. We must cleanse this valley of the evil that has taken root. We must be God's instrument."
The atmosphere in Redemption Creek became thick with impending violence, a mob mentality waiting only for a spark. The section ended on a note of deep and terrible foreboding, as if summoned by the hatred brewing in the valley. A fierce autumn storm rolled in from the north. The sky turned the color of a deep bruise, and the wind began to howl. stripping the last of the dying leaves from the cottonwood trees. The storm of nature was a perfect mirror for the storm of human hatred gathering around them. Jedediah and Alara worked together in the fading light, their movements economical and purposeful. They were not panicking. They were preparing. He boarded the windows on the north side of the house. She helped him reinforce the main door to the barn. There was a sense that this was not just a natural storm they were preparing for, but a man-made one. They knew that Croft and his mob, fueled by the preacher's words, were coming for them. They finished their work and stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the black clouds churn and the first bolts of lightning split the sky. Their faces were grim but resolved. They had come too far, fought too hard, and found too much in each other to run now. They would face the storm, whatever it brought. The storm broke over Stonefall, not as weather, but as a physical assault. The wind ceased to be wind and became a solid, roaring force that howled with the voice of a banshee, trying to tear the very shingles from the roof. Rain did not fall. It was driven in blinding, horizontal sheets that hammered against the boarded windows and found every crack in the old house. The world outside was a churning vortex of blackness and water, a natural chaos that served as a fitting overture for the human chaos that was about to be unleashed. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with an unbearable tension. Jedediah stood by the hearth, the firelight casting his face in stark relief. In his hands was his father's old Winchester rifle. He worked the lever action, the smooth, metallic sound of a cartridge sliding into the chamber unnaturally loud in the strained silence. The action felt both utterly futile and absolutely necessary. He could not fight a mob with a rifle. Not and live, but he would not face them unarmed. He would not face them as a victim. Alara stood near him, her hands busy lighting another lantern, though her movements were a pretense of calm. They had not spoken much in the last hour. There was nothing left to say. Their every look, every brief touch of a hand on an arm, was a conversation. It spoke of their shared fear, a cold, hard knot in the pit of the stomach, but it also spoke of a shared determination, a grim resolve that had settled deep in their bones. They would not run. This was their home. Under the shrieking cover of the storm, they came. Silas Croft led a mob of nearly 20 townsmen, their forms like dark, lurching specters in the tempest. Swinging lanterns cast wild, distorted shadows, illuminating faces contorted with a mixture of fear and the righteous rage only cheap whiskey and a fanatic's sermon can produce. Marshall Harding rode beside Croft, the silver star on his chest a grotesque mockery of the law, lending a thin, corrupt legitimacy to the night's violence. Their intent was clear. They had come to drive the evil from the valley, to break Jedediah Stone and the heathen woman he harbored by any means necessary. Croft's plan was not simply intimidation. It was total destruction. He did not lead the mob to the house, but to the corrals where the newly tamed mustangs, their most valuable asset, were sheltered. "Start with the horses." Croft's voice was a roar, barely audible over the storm. "Drive them toward the west fence! Scatter them!" The first sign of the attack was not a human shout, but the sound of pure animal terror. The screams of the mustangs, high and shrill, tore through the night, a sound of agony that mixed with the boom of thunder. Jedediah and Alara exchanged a single, horrified look and rushed for the door, pulling on their slickers as they ran out into the maelstrom. They were too late. They could only watch in helpless horror as the mob, whooping and hollering, drove the terrified horses from the corral and stampeded them toward a weak section of fence bordering a steep, rock-strewn ravine. Their hope for financial salvation, the symbol of their resilience, was sent plunging into the roaring darkness, their panicked cries swallowed by the storm. It was an act of such calculated cruelty it stole the breath. With their future in ruins, the mob turned their attention to the main barn. They descended upon it like a pack of wolves, their goal not to kill, but to destroy the body of Jedediah's livelihood, to shatter his spirit beyond repair. The sounds of destruction began immediately. The splintering crash of an axe breaking down the stalls, the metallic clang of tools being smashed against the anvil, the ominous whoosh and crackle as men with lanterns set fire to the dry hay bales in the loft. A cold, lethal fury consumed Jedediah. This was his father's barn. This was his home. He strode toward the mob, the rain plastering his hair to his skull, his face a mask of cold rage. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder and fired a single warning shot into the black, churning sky. The crack of the rifle was sharp and definitive.
"Get off my land,"
he snarled, his voice a low growl that carried over the wind. For a moment, the mob faltered, but then someone, emboldened by whiskey, threw a rock that glanced off Jedediah's shoulder, and the world erupted into a chaotic brawl. It was not a fight of skill or strategy. It was a desperate, brutal struggle in the driving rain and the slick, sucking mud. It was Jedediah against a dozen men, his fists and the butt of his rifle swinging, fighting with the primal desperation of a man who had already lost everything and now had only one thing left to lose. Ilara, refusing to be a helpless victim cowering in the house, had followed him. She would not let him fight alone. While the brawl raged below, she climbed the ladder to the barn's loft, her mind racing, her knowledge her only weapon. She was a healer, but tonight she would be a warrior. She found sacks of ground pepper and flour and, leaning out of the loft opening, threw them down into the faces of the men closest to the door, the fine powder turning to a blinding, choking paste in the rain. Men screamed and clawed at their eyes. Stumbling back, she found a long, leather cutting whip, and with a sharp crack, used it to keep others at bay, its tip a stinging deterrent. She was fierce and protective, a wildcat defending her den, fighting alongside Jedediah in a desperate, seamless partnership. For a moment, it seemed they might actually be able to do it. Their combined, furious defiance began to push the mob back. A few of the less committed men, their drunken rage cooled by the rain and the ferocity of the resistance, began to retreat. It was this faltering that drove Silas Croft to take matters into his own hands. His plan was failing, his authority being challenged by one broken man and a woman. Enraged, he grabbed a heavy wood-splitting axe from a nearby stump. In the chaos of the fight, he stormed into the barn and began to swing the axe wildly at one of the central support beams, a massive timber that held the main weight of the roof. His intent was likely not to bring the whole structure down, but to cause a partial collapse, to use terror to finally break their spirits and scatter them. But the old barn, battered by a decade of neglect and now under the full assault of the storm, was far weaker than he knew. As the axe bit deep into the wood, there was a sound more terrifying than any thunder. It was a deep, groaning shriek of tortured timber, the sound of a giant beast dying in agony. "Ilara!" Jedediah screamed. Seeing the danger, the entire central section of the barn roof gave way at once, a catastrophic failure of wood and nail. Heavy beams, rafters, and roofing collapsed inward with a deafening roar. Jedediah shoved Ilara with all his might, trying to get her clear of the falling debris. He was a second too late. A heavy, splintered beam, thick as a tree trunk, crashed down. Ilara gave a sharp, broken cry as it struck her, pinning her to the muddy ground. The catastrophic collapse and the woman's scream shocked the last of the drunken rage out of the mob. The reality of what had happened, the shift from vandalism to something far more terrible, sobered them in an instant. They scattered into the night, their righteous crusade forgotten, leaving Silas Croft standing alone in the rain, staring at the ruin he had created. For a moment, Jedediah was frozen, the world a roaring, silent void around him. Then her name tore from his throat, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. He scrambled toward the wreckage, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He dug through the splintered wood and debris, his hands raw and bleeding. His only thought her name, over and over again like a desperate prayer. He found her. She was conscious, her eyes wide with a pain so profound it seemed to eclipse the storm itself. The splintered, jagged end of the massive beam had crashed down upon her, pinning her to the earth. But it had not just crushed her. It had impaled her. The thick, ragged point of wood had driven through her upper thigh and deep into her abdomen. A dark, horrifying pool of blood was already soaking the muddy ground around her, steaming in the cold rain. He knew instantly, with a cold, sick certainty, that the situation was impossible. Trying to move the beam would require a team of horses. Trying to move her while the beam was still inside her would tear her apart. He was trapped, miles from a doctor, with the woman he loved dying before his very eyes. It was the ultimate nightmare, a horrifying, suffocating echo of the helplessness he had felt as a boy, watching the fire consume his family. He was losing everything all over again. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uselessly over her body, his mind shattering. Her hand, slick with rain and mud, found his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Her breath came in ragged, agonizing pants, her healer's mind fighting through the fog of shock and unimaginable pain.
"Jedediah,"
she gasped, her eyes locking on his.
"The beam. It has to come out." "No, Ilara, no, I cannot move it."
"Not the whole thing," she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate thread of sound. She knew the jagged wood inside her was causing catastrophic damage with every passing second. Leaving it in was a certain, agonizing death.
"You have to pull it straight. Break the outside."
She coughed, a spray of blood on her lips. "Go deeper. To get a grip. Make it quick inside." He stared at her, the horror of her request washing over him. She was asking him to perform an act of brutal, intimate violence upon her. She was asking him to reach into the wound, to grip the splintered instrument of her death and pull it free, an act that could sever an artery and kill her instantly. It was an impossible choice. It was the ultimate act of trust. It was her placing her last, desperate chance at life entirely in his hands. The world was reduced to the howling of the storm, the splintered ruin of the barn, and Ilara's ragged breathing. Jedediah knelt in the mud and debris beside her, her desperate words hanging in the air, a plea that was both a medical directive and an act of impossible faith. "Go deeper. Make it quick inside." He looked at the jagged, blood-slicked beam piercing her body, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. In that moment, he was no longer a man. He was a terrified boy again, standing helpless before a wall of flame, the smell of smoke and death filling his lungs, the ghosts of his family rising from the ashes of his memory to whisper of his failure. For a long, paralyzing moment, he was lost, drowning in the grief and terror of the past. Then, through the haze of his own horror, he focused on her eyes. They were wide with an agony he could barely comprehend. But beneath the pain, there was something else. There was an unwavering, absolute trust in him. It was a trust so pure and so powerful, it cut through the ghosts of his past like a bolt of lightning. She was not asking him to be the boy who had failed to save his family. She was trusting him to be the man who would save her. That trust shattered his paralysis and ignited a strength he never knew he possessed. The world snapped back into sharp, terrible focus. His movements became swift and deliberate. He found a heavy, broken piece of timber and, using it as a lever, jammed it against the main beam and threw all his weight against it. With a sickening crack, the external portion of the beam snapped, leaving a shorter, more manageable spike of wood protruding from her body. He tossed the timber aside and knelt over her again. "I am here, Ilara," he whispered, his voice a raw prayer. "I am here." He took a deep, shuddering breath and did as she had asked. He pushed his fingers into the gaping, bloody wound alongside the splintered wood. The feeling was grotesque, a violation of every natural instinct, but he forced himself deeper, until his fingers could get a firm, desperate grip on the jagged shaft inside her. He felt her body tense, a low moan escaping her lips. He closed his eyes. "Make it quick," her voice echoed in his mind. In one swift, brutal, upward motion, he pulled. Ilara screamed. It was not a human sound. It was a sound torn from the very fabric of her soul, a note of pure, elemental agony that ripped through the roar of the storm and seared itself into Jedediah's heart forever. And then, silence. She went limp, her head falling to the side as she passed into unconsciousness. Jedediah did not hesitate. He tore his own shirt from his body and balled it up, pressing it hard against the gushing wound, fighting to stem the bleeding that was stealing her life with every passing second. He scooped her limp body into his arms, the broken piece of timber he had pulled from her falling to the mud with a soft thud. He carried her through the driving rain, his mind a torrent of frantic, incoherent prayers, his every step a battle against the mud, the wind, and the crushing weight of despair. Inside the ranch house, in the warm, dry circle of lantern light, he became the healer. The world outside, the destroyed barn, the dead horses, the hateful mob, ceased to exist. There was only Ilara, her life a flickering candle flame he had to shield from the storm. Using the knowledge he had absorbed from months of watching her, he went to work. He gently cleaned the horrific wound with boiled water and the last of her antiseptic herbs. He found her pouch of dried yarrow, the plant she had used on his own hand what felt like a lifetime ago, and packed it tightly into the wound to stanch the bleeding, his hands moving with a surprising steadiness that seemed to belong to someone else. The gaping wound needed to be closed. He found her small fishing kit, took a fine, curved hook, and carefully broke off the barb, threading it with a length of boiled gut. He began to stitch the torn flesh together. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor, moved with a delicate precision, each stitch a prayer, each knot a plea for her to live. For days, he did not sleep. He sat by her side in a constant, unwavering vigil. The storm passed, but a new storm, a fever, took hold of her. He bathed her brow with cool water, fighting the fire that raged within her. He brewed thin broths and forced them, drop by drop, between her cracked lips, and he talked. He talked to her constantly, his voice a low, steady murmur in the silent house. He told her stories of the future they would have, of the barn they would rebuild, of the horses they would raise. He told her of the spring, of how the wildflowers would look in the meadow where his sister Lily used to play. He talked to her, begged her, willed her to fight, his voice the only anchor in the vast, silent ocean she was drifting on. The world did not exist beyond the four walls of that room. There was only Ilara and his desperate, stubborn will to keep her alive. Slowly, miraculously, his will prevailed. After a week, her fever broke. A few days later, she opened her eyes. Her first word was his name, a sound no louder than a sigh. But to Jedediah, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. As Ilara began her slow, painful recovery, the world outside finally intruded. Sheriff Miller, a decent but cautious man who had long been cowed by Silas Croft's influence, finally rode out to Stonefall. Rumors of a terrible accident during the storm had reached Redemption Creek, and his conscience could no longer be ignored. He found a scene of utter devastation. The ravine was filled with the broken bodies of the Mustangs. The barn was a collapsed, blackened ruin, and inside the house he found Ilara, pale and weak but alive, and Jedediah Stone, a man he barely recognized. The haunted stoic rancher was gone. In his place was a man whose grief had been forged into something as cold, hard, and sharp as forged steel. Jedediah told him everything. He spoke without emotion, his voice flat and even, detailing the mob, the stampede, and the deliberate destruction. He named Silas Croft as the leader, the man who had swung the axe that had brought the barn down upon Ilara. He had no proof, no witnesses who would speak for him, but the sheer, unshakable conviction in his voice, combined with the irrefutable evidence of the destruction around them, was enough. For the first time, Sheriff Miller saw not a cursed man, but a wronged one. The confrontation happened in the saloon. The air went thick and silent as Jedediah, with Sheriff Miller at his side, walked through the swinging doors. Silas Croft was at the bar, holding court, a confident smirk on his face. "Well, Sheriff," Croft said, his voice booming with false cordiality. "To what do we owe the honor? And I see you have found our local ghost." "Silas Croft," the sheriff said, his voice steady. "I am placing you under arrest for leading a mob, for the destruction of property, and for the attempted murder of Ilara." Croft laughed, a loud, arrogant sound. He looked around the room at the familiar faces, men who depended on his business, who feared his power. "On what grounds? Sheriff, the word of this cursed fool? Who will speak against me?" The silence that followed was heavy with fear and complicity. But then a voice, young and trembling, cut through it. "I will." Billy, a young farmhand who had been swept up in the mob, stepped forward from the back of the room. His face was pale, his eyes haunted by the memory of Ilara's scream. "I was there," he said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "I saw it. I saw everything. Jedediah is telling the truth. Mr. Croft led us. He told us to stampede the horses. I saw him take the axe to the beam." Billy's confession broke the dam of silence. It gave courage to the guilt-ridden. Another man spoke up, then another. The U.S. Marshal, Harding, who had been drinking quietly in a corner, saw the tide turn with undeniable finality. Without a word, he set his glass down and slipped out the back door of the saloon, disappearing from Redemption Creek forever. The sheriff put the irons on a stunned and suddenly powerless Silas Croft. The final piece of the puzzle, the truth that underpinned a decade of lies, fell into place during the sheriff's investigation. While searching Croft's office, he found a locked safe. Inside, among deeds and banknotes, was an old, leather-bound journal belonging to Silas's father, a man as cruel and ambitious as his son. The journal detailed a long and bitter dispute over water rights with Jedediah's father. The final entry on the matter was dated the night of the fire. It described, in cold, methodical detail, how he had waited for a winter storm, ridden to Stonefall, and set the fire that had killed the Stone family, eliminating his rival and ensuring his control over the valley's water. The Stonefall curse was revealed for what it was, a horrifying lie, a ghost story Silas had carefully perpetuated for years to keep people away from the land, to keep its value down until the day he could acquire it, and its precious water, for himself. The revelation shattered Redemption Creek. The town's superstitions crumbled in the face of such a cold and calculated evil. And for Jedediah, the truth was a release. The lifelong burden of guilt, the gnawing fear that he was somehow responsible, that he was cursed, was lifted from his soul. The curse was broken, not by magic or prayer, but by the simple, brutal truth. Justice was served, and Silas Croft was sent to prison for a very long time. Months passed. The harsh winter gave way to a new spring. The snow melted, and the land, scarred but resilient, came to life again. Ilara was still weak, and she walked with a pronounced limp that would likely never fully disappear. A permanent, physical scar that matched the ones Jedediah carried on his soul. But she was alive. They stood together on the porch of their home, looking out at the valley. The barn was slowly being rebuilt, a new frame of pale, fresh-cut pine rising from the ashes of the old. A few of the townsfolk, led by a repentant Billy, came out on Sundays to help, their quiet labor a form of apology that was accepted without words. The land no longer felt haunted. The ghosts had been laid to rest by the truth. It was just land now, a place of hardship. Yes, but also of profound beauty and new beginnings. Jedediah put his arm around Ilara's shoulders, pulling her close. They watched the sun set, its golden light washing over the valley, painting the peaks in hues of orange and rose. They had been through the darkest of tragedies, had walked through the fire and the storm. But in finding each other, in the trust and love that had been forged in that crucible, They had found a hope that was stronger, more resilient, and more real than any curse. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.